In the damp cold of an afternoon, a thin boy walks along overgrown trails, hiding a poorly wrapped bundle in his arms. In the bundle, an injured German shepherd with a bloody paw and short of breath. The boy stops beside an abandoned barn, watches the road, and pushes the old door without a sound. Through the cracks, a hen pecks at the wet ground, alert to the sound of footsteps. The boy releases the dog onto a pile of straw and disappears into the darkness of the night. Deep voices and flashlights cross the woods, tearing through the silence. But what happens next? Do you love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss a single one. Thank you for being with us. Now back to our story. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Millbrook Valley like a secret waiting to be whispered. In this forgotten corner of rural Tennessee, where time seemed to move as slowly as the creek that meandered through, weathered farmland, 12-year-old Tommy Henderson pulled his worn baseball cap down over his sandy hair and stepped carefully through the tall grass behind his family's modest farmhouse. The rooster's crow had awakened him before dawn, just as it had every day for as long as he could remember, but today felt different somehow, charged with an electricity he couldn't quite name. Tommy was the kind of boy who moved through the world like a shadow, small for his age and quiet by nature. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, he had somehow mastered the art of being invisible, slipping between the conversations of adults who rarely noticed when he entered or left a room. His father, Bill Henderson, worked double shifts at the lumber mill just to keep their small family afloat, while his mother, Sarah, took in sewing from the wealthier families across town. They were good people, honest people, but they carried the weight of worry in their shoulders and the lines around their eyes. The Henderson property bordered the vast holdings of Clayton Worthington III, a man whose family had owned most of the valley for 3 generations. Where the Hendersons had a modest 3-bedroom house with peeling paint and a roof that leaked when it rained hard, Worthington lived in a sprawling mansion that sat on a hill overlooking the entire valley like a castle watching over its subjects. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone in Millbrook Valley, least of all on Tommy, who had grown up hearing whispered conversations between his parents about late notices and overdue bills. This particular morning, Tommy was collecting kindling for the old wood stove that heated their house. The electric bill had been too high last month, and his mother had quietly returned to burning wood to keep costs down. He moved methodically through the edge of the forest that separated their property from Worthington's vast estate, gathering dry branches and fallen twigs, when an unfamiliar sound stopped him in his tracks. It was a whimper, barely audible above, the rustle of leaves in the early morning breeze. Tommy froze, his small pile of kindling forgotten as he strained to listen. There it was again, a soft pain sound that seemed to come from deeper in the woods, from the direction of Worthington's land. Everyone in Millbrook Valley knew that crossing onto Worthington property without permission was asking for trouble. The man had security guards who patrolled his land, and more than one local had been arrested for trespassing over the years. But the sound came again, more urgent this time, and Tommy found his feet moving toward it almost without his permission. He had always been drawn to injured things, a trait that had gotten him in trouble more than once when he'd brought home stray cats or birds with broken wings. His mother would scold him gently, reminding him that they could barely afford to feed themselves, let alone take in every creature that needed help. But she always let him keep them until they were well enough to fend for themselves. The deeper Tommy ventured into the woods, the more nervous he became. The trees grew thicker here, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out much of the early morning light. He could see the tall chain-link fence that marked the boundary of Worthington's property in the distance, topped with razor wire that glinted menacingly in the filtered sunlight. Warning signs were posted every few yards. Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But the whimpering was coming from just beyond that fence, and as Tommy crept closer, he could see something moving in the underbrush. His heart hammered against his ribs as he pushed through a gap in the fence that had been hidden by overgrown vines. He knew he was breaking the law, knew that if he was caught it would mean trouble not just for him, but for his family. Worthington had a reputation for making life difficult for anyone who crossed him. What Tommy found on the other side of that fence would haunt his dreams for weeks to come. A beautiful German shepherd, its golden and black coat matted with mud and blood, was caught in a rusty leg trap that had clearly been set for much larger game. The dog's dark eyes met Tommy's with a mixture of pain and desperate hope that made the boy's chest tighten with emotion. The animal's breathing was shallow and labored, and Tommy could see that it had been struggling against the trap for hours, maybe longer. The sight of the suffering animal triggered something deep within Tommy's chest, a feeling that was part anger and part determination. He had seen Worthington's security guards around town, big men in dark uniforms who seemed to take pleasure in intimidating the locals. He had heard the stories about Worthington's business practices, the way he bought up failing farms for pennies on the dollar and then let them sit empty until he could develop them into something more profitable. But this was different. This was cruelty for its own sake, and Tommy couldn't stand by and do nothing. Moving as quietly as he could, Tommy approached the trapped dog. The animal watched him warily, but didn't try to bite when Tommy knelt beside it and examined the trap. The metal jaws had clamped down on the dog's right front leg, and Tommy could see that while the injury was painful, it wasn't life-threatening if he could get the animal free quickly. The trap was old and rusty, with a spring mechanism that Tommy thought he could manage if he was careful. Working slowly and talking in soothing whispers to keep the dog calm, Tommy managed to pry open the jaws of the trap. The German shepherd whimpered softly as its leg was freed, but it didn't try to run. Instead, it looked up at Tommy with an expression that seemed almost grateful. Without thinking, Tommy pulled off his flannel shirt and tore it into strips, using them to bind the dog's injured leg. The wound was deep but clean, and Tommy thought it would heal properly if it was kept clean and bandaged. The hardest part was yet to come. The dog was too injured to walk far, and Tommy was too small to carry a full-grown German shepherd very far. But he couldn't leave the animal here, not when Worthington's men might return to check their traps. Tommy had heard rumors about what happened to animals that were found on Worthington's property, and none of those stories had happy endings. Summoning strength he didn't know he possessed, Tommy managed to get the dog to its feet and began the slow, careful journey back toward his family's property. The animal leaned heavily against him, limping badly but game to try. They moved through the forest like ghosts, Tommy constantly listening for the sound of approaching footsteps or the rumble of the all-terrain vehicles that Worthington's security team used to patrol the property. It took them nearly an hour to reach the old barn that sat at the far edge of the Henderson property, a ramshackle building that hadn't been used for anything but storage since Tommy's grandfather had passed away 5 years earlier. Tommy had played in the barn as a younger child, and he knew every inch of its dusty interior. More importantly, he knew that his parents rarely went there, and that it would provide shelter for the injured dog while Tommy figured out what to do next. As Tommy settled the German shepherd on a bed of old hay and found a rusty bucket to fill with water from the hand pump outside, he realized that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't fully understand. He was no longer just the invisible boy who collected kindling and did his chores without complaint. He was now the keeper of a secret that could put his entire family at risk, and the protector of a creature that depended on him for survival. The dog looked up at him with those dark, intelligent eyes, and Tommy made a silent promise that he would do whatever it took to keep this animal safe, no matter what the consequences might be. The old barn smelled of dust and forgotten seasons, a mixture of weathered wood and the faint sweetness of hay that had been stored there decades ago. Tommy worked quietly in the dim light that filtered through gaps in the wooden boards, creating a makeshift bed for the German Shepherd he had named Scout in his mind. The dog watched his every movement with alert eyes, as if understanding that this small boy was now its lifeline in a world that had shown it only cruelty. Tommy had always been resourceful, a trait born from necessity in a household where money was scarce, and creativity often made the difference between having something and going without. He found an old horse blanket that his grandfather had left behind, shaking it out carefully before spreading it over the hay to create a softer surface for Scout to rest on. The dog settled onto the makeshift bed with visible relief, though it kept its head raised and ears perked, listening for any sign of danger. The boy's hands worked gently but efficiently as he examined Scout's injured leg more carefully in the better light of the barn. The trap had left deep puncture wounds, but Tommy was relieved to see that no bones appeared to be broken. He had learned basic first aid from his mother, who had once dreamed of becoming a nurse before life had taken her in a different direction. Using water from the old pump outside and strips torn from a clean rag he found in the barn, Tommy cleaned the wounds as best he could. Scout whimpered softly during the process, but didn't try to pull away or snap at Tommy's hands. There was an intelligence in the dog's eyes that suggested it understood that this boy was trying to help, not hurt. When Tommy finished bandaging the leg, Scout actually licked his hand, a gesture that made the boy's heart swell with an emotion he couldn't quite name. The afternoon passed quietly as Tommy sat with Scout, sharing the peanut butter sandwich he had brought for his own lunch. The dog ate gratefully, its tail wagging weakly as Tommy stroked its head and spoke in the soft, soothing tones he used when his mother was having one of her bad days, when the weight of their circumstances seemed too heavy for her to bear. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Tommy knew he would have to return to the house soon. His parents would expect him for dinner, and his absence would be noticed if he stayed away too long. But leaving Scout alone felt like abandonment, especially when the dog looked at him with such trust and dependence in its dark eyes. "I'll be back," Tommy whispered, scratching behind Scout's ears. "I promise I'll come back with more food and water. You just rest and get better, okay?" Tommy was halfway across the field between the barn and his house when he heard the sound that made his blood run cold. The low rumble of all-terrain vehicles echoed across the valley, coming from the direction of Worthington's property. He dropped to the ground instinctively, pressing himself flat against the earth as the sound grew closer. Through the tall grass, he could see the beams of powerful flashlights sweeping across the landscape, searching. The voices carried on the evening air, rough and irritated. "Boss ain't gonna be happy about this," one man said, his words barely audible from Tommy's hiding spot. "Someone messed with his traps, and now we got a missing dog to boot." "That German Shepherd was worth $3,000, another voice replied. "Worthington's gonna want to know who's been on his property, and he's gonna want to know tonight." Tommy's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized what he had done. Scout wasn't just any stray dog he had rescued. It was Worthington's property, probably a guard dog or hunting animal that the man valued highly. The boy felt sick as he understood the magnitude of his situation. He hadn't just trespassed on Worthington's land. He had essentially stolen something valuable from the most powerful man in the valley. The search party spent another hour combing the woods near where Tommy had found Scout, their flashlights creating an eerie dance of shadows among the trees. Tommy stayed hidden in the grass until long after the sound of their vehicles had faded into the distance, his mind racing with the implications of what he had done and what he needed to do next. When he finally made it back to the house, his mother was standing at the kitchen window, her face creased with worry. "Tommy, where have you been?" she asked as he slipped through the back door. "You've been gone all day and your father's been asking for you." "Sorry, Mom," Tommy said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I was collecting kindling and lost track of time." Sarah Henderson studied her son's face in the warm light of the kitchen, and Tommy had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through his lie. His mother had always been perceptive, able to read his moods and motivations with an accuracy that sometimes startled him, but she simply nodded and turned back to the stove where she was stirring a pot of vegetable soup. "Wash up for dinner," she said quietly. "And Tommy, if something's troubling you, you know you can talk to me, right?" Tommy nodded, though he knew that this was one secret he could never share with his parents. They had enough worries without adding the possibility of legal trouble. With Clayton Worthington to their list, he went through the motions of dinner, listening to his father talk about the layoffs that were rumored to be coming to the lumber mill, watching his mother count and recount the small stack of bills that sat on the kitchen counter. That night, Tommy lay in his narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sound of his parents' muffled conversation through the thin walls. He could hear the worry in their voices, the careful way they discussed which bills could be paid this month and which would have to wait. The weight of his secret felt heavier with each passing hour, but the thought of Scout alone and injured in the barn kept him from regretting his actions. When the house was finally quiet and he was sure his parents were asleep, Tommy slipped out of bed and crept downstairs. He raided the refrigerator as quietly as possible, wrapping leftover chicken and a slice of bread in a clean dish towel. He filled a thermos with water and grabbed a small flashlight from the kitchen drawer, the same flashlight his father used when he had to fix something in the basement or check on a strange noise in the yard. The walk to the barn in the darkness felt longer and more dangerous than it had during the day. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every sound made Tommy's heart skip a beat, but Scout's greeting when he pushed open the barn door made the risk worthwhile. The dog's tail wagged enthusiastically, and it struggled to stand despite its injured leg. "Easy, boy," Tommy whispered, kneeling beside Scout and offering the food he had brought. "You need to rest and let that leg heal." As Scout ate, Tommy examined the bandages and was relieved to see that there was no sign of infection. The dog's eyes were clearer and more alert than they had been that afternoon, and its breathing seemed stronger. Tommy allowed himself to hope that Scout might recover fully from its ordeal. But even as he sat in the darkness of the barn, stroking Scout's head and listening to the night sounds of the valley, Tommy knew that their troubles were just beginning. Worthington would continue searching for his missing dog, and eventually someone would think to check the abandoned barn on the Henderson property. Tommy needed a better plan, a safer place to hide Scout while the dog recovered, and he needed to find it soon. The next morning brought news that made Tommy's stomach clench with fear. He was helping his mother hang laundry on the line behind their house when Mrs. Patterson from down the road stopped by with fresh gossip and a worried expression. Mrs. Patterson was the unofficial town telegraph, a kindly woman who somehow managed to know everything that happened in Millbrook Valley within hours of it occurring. "Sarah, you haven't seen any strange dogs around your property, have you?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her voice carrying the weight of someone who bore important news. "Clayton Worthington's got his security team going door to door this morning, asking about a missing German Shepherd. Valuable breeding dog, they say. He's offering a $1,000 reward for its return, no questions asked." Tommy's mother paused in hanging up one of his father's work shirts, her hands gripping the clothespin tighter than necessary. $1,000? She repeated, and Tommy could hear the longing in her voice. $1,000 would pay their overdue electric bill and put food on the table for months. "That's what they're saying," Mrs. Patterson confirmed. "Of course, there's also talk that whoever took the dog might find themselves in serious legal trouble. You know how Mr. Worthington feels about people taking what belongs to him. Tommy forced himself to continue helping with the laundry, but his hands were shaking as he handed his mother another clothespin. The reward money would solve so many of his family's problems, but claiming it would mean turning Scout over to the man who had set the trap that injured him in the first place. The thought of Scout being returned to Worthington's property, possibly to face punishment for escaping, made Tommy feel physically sick. As the morning progressed, Tommy watched from his bedroom window as Worthington's security team made their way through the neighborhood. They were methodical and intimidating, two large men in dark uniforms who seemed to enjoy the fear they inspired in the local residents. When they reached the Henderson house, Tommy's father met them at the front door, his posture tense and defensive. Tommy crept to the top of the stairs to listen to the conversation, his heart pounding so hard he was afraid the men might hear it. The lead security officer, a man with a shaved head and cold eyes, explained about the missing dog and asked permission to search the Henderson property. Tommy's father, ever conscious of his family's precarious position in the community, agreed without argument. For 20 terrifying minutes, Tommy watched from his window as the two men searched the yard, the small shed where his father kept his tools, and even peered into the windows of the old barn. Tommy held his breath as they approached the building where Scout was hidden, but they seemed satisfied with their cursory examination and moved on without entering. Tommy realized that Scout must have remained quiet and still during their inspection, somehow sensing the danger. When the men finally left, Tommy's father came upstairs with a troubled expression. "Tommy, I need you to tell me the truth," Bill Henderson said, sitting on the edge of his son's bed. "Have you seen anything unusual around our property? Any dogs that don't belong here?" Tommy looked into his father's tired eyes and felt the weight of the lie he was about to tell. His father was a good man who worked hard to provide for his family despite the constant financial pressure they lived under. The last thing Tommy wanted was to add to his father's burdens, but he couldn't bring himself to reveal Scout's presence. "No, Dad," Tommy said quietly. "I haven't seen any strange dogs." His father studied his face for a long moment, and Tommy had the uncomfortable feeling that the man suspected something wasn't quite right. But Bill Henderson simply nodded and stood up. "Okay, son, but if you do see anything, you need to tell me right away. We can't afford any trouble with Clayton Worthington." After his father left, Tommy realized that his time was running out. It was only a matter of time before someone discovered Scout's hiding place, and when that happened, his family would face consequences they couldn't afford. He needed help, but he didn't know where to turn. That afternoon, while his parents thought he was doing homework, Tommy slipped out of the house and made his way to the barn. Scout greeted him with enthusiasm, his tail wagging and his eyes bright with intelligence. The dog's leg was healing well, and Tommy thought he might be able to walk short distances without too much pain. "We need to find you a better place to stay," Tommy whispered to Scout as he changed the bandages on the dog's leg. "Somewhere safer, where Mr. Worthington's men won't think to look." As Tommy pondered their options, he remembered stories he had heard around town about an elderly woman named Eleanor Blackwood, who lived in an isolated house at the far end of the valley. The stories about Mrs. Blackwood were contradictory and often frightening. Some people said she was a witch who cast spells on anyone who crossed her. Others claimed she was simply a crazy old woman who talked to her cats and chickens as if they were people. But there were other stories, quieter ones that parents didn't like their children to hear. Stories about injured animals that mysteriously appeared in Mrs. Blackwood's yard and disappeared again once they were healed. Stories about her standing up to bullies and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, regardless of the consequences to her own reputation in the community. Tommy had never met Mrs. Blackwood personally, but he had seen her once at the general store in town. She was a small, weathered woman with sharp eyes and grey hair pulled back in a severe bun. She had moved through the store with quiet dignity, ignoring the whispers and stares of the other customers. When the store clerk had been rude to her, refusing to extend credit for her groceries, she had simply placed her money on the counter and walked out with her head held high. The more Tommy thought about it, the more he became convinced that Mrs. Blackwood might be his only hope. If the stories about her helping injured animals were true, she might be willing to help Scout, and if they were false, well, he would have to figure out another solution. That evening, Tommy told his parents he was going for a walk to clear his head before bedtime. The walk to Mrs. Blackwood's house was longer than he had expected, nearly 3 miles through winding country roads and overgrown paths. By the time he reached her property, the sun was setting and shadows were growing long across the valley. Mrs. Blackwood's house was smaller than he had imagined, a neat cottage surrounded by a garden that seemed to burst with life even in the gathering darkness. Tommy could see chickens pecking in the yard and hear the soft bleating of goats somewhere behind the house. The whole place had an air of peaceful sanctuary that was completely at odds with the frightening stories he had heard about its owner. Tommy approached the front door on shaking legs, his heart hammering against his ribs. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated, wondering if he was about to make a terrible mistake. But the thought of Scout's trusting eyes gave him courage, and he rapped softly on the wooden door. The woman who answered was exactly as he remembered her from the general store. Small and weathered, but with eyes that seemed to see everything. She looked Tommy up and down with an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile, simply evaluating. "You're Bill Henderson's boy," she said in a voice that was softer than he had expected. "You're a long way from home and it's getting dark. What brings you to my door?" Tommy took a deep breath and looked into Eleanor Blackwood's sharp eyes. "Mrs. Blackwood, I need help," he said quietly. "And I think you might be the only person who can give it to me." Eleanor Blackwood studied Tommy's face for what felt like an eternity, her sharp eyes seeming to weigh his words and measure his character. The evening breeze rustled through the trees surrounding her cottage, carrying with it the scent of herbs from her garden and the soft sounds of animals settling in for the night. Tommy stood on her doorstep, his hands clenched into nervous fists, knowing that everything depended on what happened in the next few minutes. "Help," she repeated quietly, as if testing the word. "That's a dangerous thing to ask for in this valley, young man, especially when it comes to crossing certain people. Come inside and tell me what kind of trouble you found yourself in." Tommy followed her into the cottage, marveling at how different it was from what he had expected. The interior was warm and welcoming, filled with comfortable furniture and shelves lined with books. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with a pleasant, earthy scent. A fat orange cat lounged on the windowsill, regarding Tommy with sleepy indifference. Mrs. Blackwood gestured for him to sit at a small wooden table near the kitchen while she put a kettle on the stove. "Tea helps with difficult conversations," she said matter-of-factly. "Now start from the beginning and don't leave anything out. I've been around long enough to know when someone's carrying a burden too heavy for their shoulders." Tommy found himself pouring out the entire story, from finding Scout in the trap, to hiding him in the barn, to the fear that consumed him every time he thought about what Worthington might do if he discovered the truth. Mrs. Blackwood listened without interruption, her weathered hands wrapped around her teacup, her expression growing more thoughtful with each detail Tommy shared. When he finished, she was quiet for several minutes, staring into her tea as if it might hold answers to questions Tommy hadn't even thought to ask. Finally, she looked up at him with an expression that was both sad and proud. "You did the right thing," she said simply. That dog would have suffered terribly if you hadn't intervened. Clayton Worthington has been setting those traps for years, claiming they're for wild boars, but anyone with sense knows they're meant to catch and punish any animal that wanders onto his property without permission. Tommy felt a surge of relief at her words, but it was quickly followed by renewed anxiety. But what do I do now? I can't keep Scout in the barn much longer. Worthington's men are searching everywhere, and my parents will find out soon. They can't afford trouble with him. Mrs. Blackwood smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she had shown since Tommy arrived. "Bring the dog here," she said. "Tonight, if possible. I have ways of caring for injured animals that won't be discovered by Worthington's thugs." Tommy stared at her in amazement. "You'll really help us, even though it means going against Mr. Worthington?" "Child," Mrs. Blackwood said with a laugh that held no humor, "I've been going against Clayton Worthington long before you were born. He and his family have been a plague on this valley for generations, and someone needs to stand up to their bullying." She stood and walked to a window that looked out over her backyard. "Come here," she said, beckoning Tommy to join her. "I want to show you something." Tommy approached the window and gasped at what he saw. The backyard was larger than it had appeared from the front, extending into a series of carefully constructed enclosures and shelters. In the fading light, he could see several dogs of various breeds lounging in comfortable-looking doghouses, chickens pecking in a spacious coop, and goats grazing in a fenced pasture. But it was the animals themselves that made Tommy's heart race with recognition. "They're all rescues, aren't they?" he asked quietly. "Every single one," Mrs. Blackwood confirmed. "Animals that were abandoned, abused, or injured. Some of them came from Worthington's property, others from farms where they were mistreated. I've been providing sanctuary for them for over 20 years. Tommy turned to look at her with new respect and understanding. "That's why people think you're strange. They don't understand what you're really doing." "Let them think what they want," she said with a shrug. "Their opinions matter less to me than the welfare of creatures who can't speak for themselves. But you understand, don't you? You've felt that same pull to protect something innocent and defenseless." Tommy nodded, feeling as if he had finally found someone who understood the compulsion that had driven him to risk everything for Scout. "How do you do it? How do you keep it secret?" Mrs. Blackwood smiled mysteriously. "I have friends in this valley, people who share my beliefs about treating animals with kindness. They help me in ways that Worthington and his men never suspect. A bag of dog food left on my doorstep, a veterinarian who makes house calls without asking questions, neighbors who report when they see Worthington's men heading in my direction." "You mean there are others who help you?" "More than you might think," she said. "People in this valley are tired of being intimidated and bullied. They're looking for ways to fight back that don't put their families at risk. Helping rescue animals gives them a way to do something positive while also defying Worthington's cruelty." Tommy felt a surge of hope that was stronger than anything he had experienced since finding Scout in the trap. "Could I help too? I mean, really help not just with Scout, but with other animals that need rescuing?" Mrs. Blackwood studied his face carefully. "It's dangerous work, Tommy. If Worthington ever discovered what we're doing, he'd find ways to make life very difficult for everyone involved. Your family is already struggling financially. Are you sure you want to risk making their situation worse?" Tommy thought about his parents, about the way his father's shoulders sagged under the weight of providing for his family, about the careful way his mother counted bills and rationed groceries. But he also thought about Scout's trusting eyes and the way the dog had licked his hand in gratitude. He thought about the other animals he could see in Mrs. Blackwood's backyard, creatures that might have suffered or perished without her intervention. "I'm sure," he said quietly. "Someone has to stand up for them. If I don't, who will?" Mrs. Blackwood nodded approvingly. "Then we'll start with Scout. Bring him here tonight. and I'll show you how we really take care of animals in need. But first, you need to understand something important. This isn't just about rescue and rehabilitation. We're building something here, a network of people who refuse to let cruelty go unchallenged. Are you ready to be part of something bigger than yourself? Tommy thought about the fear he had carried for the past 2 days, the weight of his secret, and the constant worry about being discovered. Then he thought about the alternative, about turning Scout over to Worthington for the reward money, about pretending he had never seen the trap or heard the dog's whimpers. "Yes," he said with more conviction than he had ever felt about anything in his life. "I'm ready." Mrs. Blackwood reached out and squeezed his shoulder gently. "Then tonight, Tommy Henderson, you become part of something that started long before you were born and will continue long after you're gone. Tonight, you join a fight for justice that asks nothing more of you than courage and compassion." As Tommy prepared to leave her cottage and return home to collect Scout, he realized that his life had changed completely in the space of a single conversation. He was no longer just a boy trying to help one injured animal. He was about to become part of a resistance movement that operated in the shadows of Millbrook Valley, fighting against cruelty and indifference with nothing more than kindness and determination. Moving Scout to Mrs. Blackwood's property under cover of darkness proved to be easier than Tommy had anticipated. The German Shepherd seemed to understand the need for stealth, walking quietly beside Tommy through the shadows and never making a sound that might alert anyone to their presence. When they arrived at the cottage, Mrs. Blackwood was waiting with a warm blanket and a bowl of food that Scout devoured gratefully. "He's a beautiful animal," she said, examining Scout's injured leg by lamplight. "The healing is progressing well, but he'll need another week or 2 before he's completely mobile. We'll keep him in the recovery area until then." She led Tommy behind the cottage to a section of the property he hadn't seen before, a series of comfortable enclosures that were hidden from the road by carefully planted hedges and mature trees. Each enclosure was equipped with warm shelters, fresh water, and enough space for the animals to move around comfortably. Scout settled into his new surroundings with visible relief, curling up on a soft blanket in a way that suggested he felt truly safe for the first time since his ordeal began. "Now," Mrs. Blackwood said as they walked back toward the cottage, "your real education begins. Rescuing animals isn't just about providing food and shelter. It's about understanding how to move quietly through a community that's watching for any sign of defiance against the established order." Over the following weeks, Tommy discovered that Mrs. Blackwood's operation was far more sophisticated than he had imagined. She had contacts throughout the valley who kept her informed about animals in distress, from the postman who reported dogs chained outside without adequate shelter, to the school janitor who noticed when farm animals appeared. Malnourished or injured, the network operated through a system of subtle signals and coded messages that would have seemed innocent to anyone who didn't know what to look for. A red ribbon tied to a mailbox meant that an animal needed immediate attention. A certain arrangement of garden tools left outside a house indicated that Worthington's security team was planning increased patrols in that area. Even the local diner participated, with the waitress casually mentioning to trusted customers when she had seen Worthington's men asking questions around town. Tommy's role in the network grew gradually as Mrs. Blackwood tested his discretion and reliability. At first, he simply helped with feeding and caring for the animals at her property. But as she became more confident in his abilities, she began taking him on actual rescue missions. Their first mission together took them to an abandoned farmhouse where a litter of puppies had been left to fend for themselves after their owner had been forced to sell his property to Worthington. The puppies were thin and frightened, huddled together in a collapsing barn, while their mother searched desperately for food in the surrounding fields. Worthington bought this place, knowing the family couldn't take their animals with them to their new apartment in town, Mrs. Blackwood explained as they approached the nervous mother dog with slow, careful movements. He's hoping they'll all simply disappear so he doesn't have to deal with the inconvenience of having them removed. Working together, Tommy and Mrs. Blackwood managed to coax the mother dog and her puppies into traveling crates. The adult dog was suspicious at first, but she seemed to sense that these humans meant no harm to her babies. The puppies, once they realized food was involved, were eager to follow their mother anywhere. "Where will they go?" Tommy asked as they loaded the crates into Mrs. Blackwood's pickup truck. "I have contacts in the next county who specialize in finding homes for young animals," she explained. "They'll be placed with families who will love and care for them properly. It's one of the most rewarding parts of this work, knowing that these creatures will live happy, healthy lives instead of suffering needlessly." As the weeks passed, Tommy found himself becoming more skilled at reading the subtle signs that indicated an animal was in distress. He learned to move quietly through the community, observing without being observed, gathering information that could help Mrs. Blackwood plan her rescue operations. But their success didn't go unnoticed. Clayton Worthington, frustrated by the continuing disappearance of animals from properties he controlled, began increasing the pressure on the local community. He hired additional security personnel and offered substantial rewards for information about anyone who might be interfering with his business interests. The increased scrutiny made everyone in the network more nervous. Mrs. Patterson stopped by the Henderson house one afternoon with news that made Tommy's blood run cold. "They're saying that Worthington's hired some kind of private investigator," she whispered to Tommy's mother as they stood in the kitchen. "Someone from outside the valley who specializes in tracking down people who steal property. Sarah, you need to make sure Tommy stays close to home these days. There's no telling what that man might do if he thinks someone in this neighborhood is involved in his troubles." Tommy listened from the next room, his heart racing as he realized how much danger he had placed himself and his family in. But when he thought about Scout, now fully recovered and helping Mrs. Blackwood train newly rescued dogs to trust humans again, he knew he couldn't stop. The network had become something bigger than just rescuing individual animals. It had become a way for the people of Millbrook Valley to reclaim some measure of dignity and self-respect in the face of Worthington's bullying. That evening, Tommy made his way to Mrs. Blackwood's cottage through routes he had memorized to avoid the main roads where Worthington's security team was most likely to patrol. When he arrived, he found her in deep conversation with two people he recognized but had never formally met: Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the veterinarian from the next town over, and Bob Wilson, who owned the feed store in Millbrook Valley. "Tommy," Mrs. Blackwood said as he approached, "I think it's time you met some of our other allies. Dr. Martinez has been providing medical care for our rescues, and Bob has been supplying food and other necessities." Dr. Martinez was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and capable hands that moved gently when she examined the animals in Mrs. Blackwood's care. "You're the boy who rescued the German Shepherd," she said with a smile. "Eleanor told me about your courage in getting him away from that trap. That was excellent first aid you provided, by the way." Bob Wilson was a man Tommy had seen many times at his feed store, but he had never suspected that the quiet, serious businessman was part of Mrs. Blackwood's network. "Your family shops at my store sometimes," Bobby said with a nod of recognition. "Good people, your parents. They're struggling, but they always pay their bills eventually." "The reason I wanted you to meet Dr. Martinez and Bob," Mrs. Blackwood explained, "is because we're facing a crisis. Worthington's increased security is making it much more difficult to operate safely. We need to expand our network to include more people, but we also need to be more careful about who we trust. Dr. Martinez nodded gravely. I've been treating animals that have clearly been abused or neglected, but the people who bring them to me are too frightened of Worthington to admit where the injuries came from. The level of cruelty is getting worse, not better. And I'm hearing things at the store, Bob added. Farmers talking about how they'd like to get their animals away from Worthington's influence, but they're afraid of losing their livelihoods if they cross him. There are people in this valley who want to help, but they need to know they won't be abandoned if Worthington retaliates. Tommy listened to their conversation with growing understanding of how complex and dangerous their mission really was. They weren't just rescuing animals. They were challenging an entire system of intimidation and control that had dominated the valley for decades. "What do you need me to do?" Tommy asked quietly. Mrs. Blackwood smiled at him with an expression of pride and affection. "We need you to help us identify other young people who might be willing to join our cause. Kids your age can move through the community without attracting as much attention as adults. They can gather information and help with rescues in ways that older people can't." "But," Dr. Martinez added seriously, "you need to be very careful about who you approach. If the wrong person finds out what we're doing, it could mean the end of everything we've built here." As Tommy walked home that night, taking a circuitous route through back roads and wooded paths, he realized that he was no longer just helping to rescue individual animals. He was becoming a recruiter for a resistance movement that was growing larger and more organized with each passing day. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, but he knew there was no turning back now. The private investigator Clayton Worthington hired arrived in Millbrook Valley on a grey Tuesday morning in late October, driving a nondescript sedan that seemed to blend into the landscape like a predator stalking its prey. Marcus Reed was a thin man with cold eyes and the kind of patience that came from years of tracking people who didn't want to be found. Within hours of his arrival, everyone in the valley seemed to sense that something had changed, that the game they had been playing with Worthington was about to become much more serious. Tommy first became aware of Reed's presence when he noticed the sedan parked across from the school, its driver watching the children as they walked home. The man made no effort to hide his surveillance, and Tommy felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that Worthington was no longer just looking for missing animals. He was looking for the people responsible for taking them. That evening, Mrs. Blackwood called an emergency meeting of the core network members at her cottage. When Tommy arrived, he found the group in a state of barely controlled panic. Dr. Martinez was pacing nervously, while Bob Wilson sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. "He's already been to my clinic," Dr. Martinez said without preamble. "Asked about any unusual cases I've treated recently, any animals brought in with injuries consistent with traps or abuse. I told him I couldn't discuss my cases due to patient confidentiality, but he made it clear that he wasn't going to give up easily. He came by the feed store too," Bob added grimly. "Wanted to know about unusual purchases, anyone buying large quantities of animal food or medical supplies. Started asking my customers questions when they came in. I'm afraid some of them might say something without realizing what they're revealing." Mrs. Blackwood sat quietly in her rocking chair, her weathered hands folded in her lap. But Tommy could see the tension in her shoulders. "He's also been asking questions about me specifically," she said finally. "Several people have called to warn me that he's been inquiring about my property, my background, my relationships with people in the community." "What do we do?" Tommy asked, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. "Do we stop the rescues until he leaves?" "If we stop now," Mrs. Blackwood said firmly, "animals will suffer and possibly perish while we wait for this man to finish his investigation. And there's no guarantee that he'll leave just because we suspend our activities." Worthington is paying him well, and he'll keep digging until he finds something. Dr. Martinez stopped pacing and turned to face the group. Then, we need to be smarter about how we operate. No more large-scale rescues, no more unnecessary risks. We focus on the most urgent cases and make sure we don't leave any trails that Reed can follow. It was Bob Wilson who voiced what they were all thinking. What if someone in the valley decides that a $1,000 reward is worth more than their loyalty to animals they've never met? What if Reed finds someone willing to talk? The question hung in the air like a dark cloud, and Tommy realized that their network was more fragile than he had understood. It was built on trust and shared values, but it only took one person to bring it all crashing down. Over the next several days, Tommy watched Reed's investigation unfold with growing alarm. The man was methodical and thorough, interviewing people throughout the valley with a persistence that wore down even the most determined resistance. Tommy noticed that some of the usual signals from their network contacts had stopped appearing, suggesting that people were becoming too frightened to participate. Then came the night that nearly ended everything. Tommy was helping Mrs. Blackwood treat an injured barn owl that had been found with a broken wing when they heard the sound of vehicles approaching the cottage. Mrs. Blackwood moved quickly to the window and peered through the curtains, her face going pale in the lamplight. "It's Reed," she whispered urgently, "and he's brought Worthington's security team with him. Tommy, you need to get out of here right now." "Deuce, what about you?" Tommy asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What about the animals?" "I'll handle this," she said, with a calm determination that amazed Tommy, even in his panic. "You're young enough that they might not suspect you're involved if you're not found here. Get to the back fence and stay low until they leave." Tommy wanted to argue, wanted to stay and help defend the woman who had shown him what courage really looked like. But he could see the wisdom in her words, and he knew that getting caught would only make the situation worse for everyone involved. He slipped out the back door just as the vehicles pulled up to the front of the cottage, moving in a crouch through Mrs. Blackwood's carefully tended garden toward the fence that separated her property from the woods beyond. Behind him, he could hear car doors slamming and voices raised in authoritative commands. From his hiding place behind a large oak tree, Tommy watched in horror as Reed and 3 security guards surrounded Mrs. Blackwood's cottage. They had flashlights and what appeared to be some kind of search warrant, and they seemed confident that they were about to make a significant discovery. Mrs. Blackwood met them at her front door with the same quiet dignity Tommy had seen her display at the general store. She listened calmly as Reed explained that they had received reports of suspicious activity on her property and demanded permission to search the premises. "Of course," she said in a voice that carried clearly across the night air, "I have nothing to hide." What followed was the longest hour of Tommy's life. He watched from the shadows as Reed and the security guards methodically searched every building on Mrs. Blackwood's property, their flashlight beams probing every corner where animals might be hidden. Tommy held his breath as they approached the recovery area where Scout had stayed during his convalescence, but the enclosures appeared to be empty in the darkness. It wasn't until much later that Tommy realized Mrs. Blackwood had somehow managed to relocate all of the animals before Reed's arrival. Whether she had been warned by one of her contacts or had simply sensed that a raid was imminent, she had acted quickly enough to save both the animals and herself from immediate discovery. But Reed wasn't satisfied with finding empty animal enclosures. He spent another hour questioning Mrs. Blackwood about her activities, her contacts in the community, and her possible involvement in the disappearance of Worthington's property. Tommy could see her answering his questions with patient politeness, never losing her composure even as the interrogation became more aggressive. Finally, frustrated by his inability to find concrete evidence of wrongdoing, Reed called off the search. But as he prepared to leave, he made a statement that chilled Tommy to the bone. "I know you're involved in this, Mrs. Blackwood," he said loudly enough for his voice to carry across the property. "And I know you're not working alone. I'm going to find your accomplices, and when I do, everyone involved in stealing Mr. Worthington's property will face the full consequences of their actions." After the vehicles departed, Tommy waited another 30 minutes before emerging from his hiding place. He found Mrs. Blackwood sitting on her front porch, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that steamed in the cool night air. "Where are the animals?" he asked as he approached. "Safe," she said simply. "I have arrangements with friends in other counties for emergencies like this. They'll be well cared for until it's safe to bring them back." Tommy sat beside her on the porch steps, still shaking from the adrenaline of watching the search. "Mrs. Blackwood, what if he comes back? What if he finds evidence we missed?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkness beyond her garden. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens," she said finally. "But Tommy, you need to understand something. What we're doing here isn't just about rescuing animals anymore. We're standing up to a system that believes might makes right, that thinks money and intimidation can silence anyone who dares to object to cruelty and injustice." But what if we lose?" Tommy asked quietly. "What if Reed finds enough evidence to stop us?" Mrs. Blackwood turned to look at him with eyes that held both sadness and fierce determination. "Then at least we'll have tried," she said. "And sometimes, trying is enough to inspire others to carry on the fight." As Tommy walked home through the darkness, taking every precaution to avoid detection, he realized that their resistance movement had reached a critical turning point. Reed's investigation was closing in on them with every passing day, and it was only a matter of time before someone in their network was exposed. But he also understood that giving up wasn't an option, not when so many innocent creatures depended on their courage and compassion. The revelation came 3 days after Reed's raid on Mrs. Blackwood's property, delivered in the most unexpected way possible. Tommy was helping his mother with grocery shopping at Wilson's feed store when Bob Wilson approached them with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Sarah, I need to speak with you and Tommy about something important," he said in a voice low enough to avoid attracting attention from other customers. "Could you come to the back office for a moment?" Tommy followed his mother through the store to Bob's small office, his heart racing with worry that Reed's investigation had somehow implicated his family. But when Bob closed the door behind them and pulled a manila folder from his desk drawer, his expression was triumphant rather than fearful. "Tommy, your courage in standing up to Worthington may have done more than just save some animals," Bob said as he opened the folder. "It may have saved this entire valley." Inside the folder were photocopies of old documents, yellowed with age and covered with official seals and signatures that Tommy didn't recognize. Bob spread them out on his desk with the care of someone handling precious artifacts. "What are these?" Sarah Henderson asked, leaning closer to examine the papers. "Property deeds," Bob explained, his voice growing more excited with each word. "Original land grants and ownership documents dating back to the 1800s. Mrs. Blackwood found them hidden in her cottage after Reed's search, tucked away in a place her grandmother had told her about years ago." Tommy stared at the documents, trying to understand their significance. "What do they prove?" Bob pointed to a detailed map that showed the boundaries of various properties in Millbrook Valley. "They prove that Clayton Worthington's family never legally owned most of the land they claim to control. These documents show that Eleanor Blackwood's family, the original Blackwood settlers, were granted ownership of nearly half the valley by the state of Tennessee in 1847. Sarah Henderson gasped as she realized the implications. "You mean Mrs. Blackwood actually owns the land where Worthington has been setting his traps and terrorizing animals. Not just that land, Bob said with a grin that transformed his usually serious face. According to these documents, the Blackwood family legally owns the property where Worthington built his mansion, most of his so-called private hunting grounds, and several of the farms he's been pressuring people to sell. Tommy felt as if the world had suddenly shifted on its axis. How is that possible? How could he own land that doesn't belong to him? The Worthington family has been using intimidation, forged documents, and legal manipulation for over a century to steal land from families who couldn't afford to fight them in court, Bob explained. They counted on people being too poor or too frightened to challenge their claims, but Mrs. Blackwood's ancestors were careful to preserve the original documentation even when they were forced to abandon their property. Sarah Henderson studied the documents more closely, her expression growing thoughtful. Bob, if these papers are authentic, why hasn't Mrs. Blackwood used them before now? Because she didn't know they existed until Reed's search forced her to remember. Something her grandmother had told her as a child, Bob said. The old woman mentioned a hiding place where important family documents had been stored, but Eleanor had forgotten about it until the stress of the investigation brought the memory back. Tommy's mind was racing as he began to understand the full implications of the discovery. Does this mean Worthington has to give the land back? Does it mean he can't hurt anyone anymore? It means, Bob said slowly, that we finally have the legal ammunition to fight back. Dr. Martinez has already contacted a lawyer she knows in Nashville, someone who specializes in property rights cases. He's agreed to review the documents and represent Mrs. Blackwood in court if necessary. Over the next several weeks, the atmosphere in Millbrook Valley changed dramatically. Word of the discovered documents spread quickly through the community, carried by the same network that had been helping to rescue animals. People who had lived in fear of Worthington's retaliation for decades suddenly found themselves hoping for justice. Marcus Reed's investigation took an unexpected turn when Mrs. Blackwood, accompanied by her lawyer, presented the evidence to the county sheriff's office. The documents were authenticated by historians at the state university, and within days, Worthington found himself facing not criminal charges for animal abuse, but civil lawsuits that threatened to strip him of most of his holdings in the valley. Tommy watched these developments unfold with a mixture of amazement and pride. The boy who had once felt invisible in his own community had somehow helped to trigger a transformation that would affect generations of families in Millbrook Valley. But the most satisfying moment came when he was finally able to visit Mrs. Blackwood's property openly, without fear of discovery or persecution. Scout, now fully recovered and serving as an unofficial guardian for the other rescued animals, greeted Tommy with the enthusiasm of a long-lost friend. The German Shepherd had grown sleek and healthy under Mrs. Blackwood's care, his injured leg showing no signs of permanent damage. More importantly, his eyes held none of the fear and pain that Tommy remembered from their first meeting in the forest. "He's become quite the helper," Mrs. Blackwood said, as she watched Scout demonstrate how he had learned to open gates and carry supplies to animals in the recovery enclosures. "I think he understands that he's part of something important here." The animal sanctuary that had once operated in secret was now becoming a legitimate rescue operation, with volunteers from throughout the valley offering their assistance openly. Dr. Martinez established regular visiting hours for providing medical care, while Bob Wilson organized supply drives that brought in more food and equipment than Mrs. Blackwood had ever dreamed of having. Tommy's parents, initially shocked to learn about their son's involvement in what they had assumed was a dangerous illegal activity, came to understand and support his commitment to animal welfare. Sarah Henderson even began volunteering at the sanctuary on weekends, using her sewing skills to create comfortable bedding for the rescued animals. "I'm proud of you," Bill Henderson told his son one evening as they walked together through Mrs. Blackwood's property, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. "You showed more courage than most adults ever do. You saw something that was wrong, and you did something about it." Clayton Worthington, faced with the loss of most of his property and mounting legal bills, eventually reached a settlement with Mrs. Blackwood and the other families whose land had been illegally claimed by his family. The mansion on the hill was sold to pay for damages and legal fees, while Worthington himself left Millbrook Valley permanently, relocating to another state where his reputation hadn't preceded him. The traps that had once terrorized animals throughout the valley were removed and destroyed, replaced by signs marking the boundaries of the newly established Blackwood Wildlife Preserve. The preserve would serve as both a sanctuary for rescued animals and an educational center where children could learn about wildlife conservation and animal welfare. On a warm spring morning, exactly 1 year after Tommy had first heard Scout's whimpers in the forest, the community of Millbrook Valley gathered for the official dedication of the Wildlife Preserve. Tommy stood on the platform beside Mrs. Blackwood as she addressed the crowd, Scout sitting proudly at his feet. "This preserve exists because one young man had the courage to act when he encountered suffering," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "Tommy Henderson reminded all of us that we have a responsibility to protect those who cannot protect themselves, regardless of the personal cost or risk involved." As the applause died down, Tommy looked out at the faces in the crowd. He saw his parents, their expressions filled with pride and love. He saw Dr. Martinez and Bob Wilson, the adults who had helped turn his desperate rescue mission into something that would benefit the entire community. He saw children from his school, their eyes bright with excitement as they looked forward to learning about the animals they would help care for. But most importantly, he saw hope. Hope for a future where kindness would triumph over cruelty, where communities would stand together against bullying and intimidation, where one person's courage could inspire others to become the best versions of themselves. Scout looked up at Tommy with those intelligent dark eyes, and the boy could have sworn he saw gratitude and understanding there. The dog that had once been trapped and suffering was now free and healthy, serving as a symbol of what was possible when people refused to accept injustice as inevitable. "You know," Mrs. Blackwood said quietly as the crowd began to disperse, "this is just the beginning. There are other communities facing similar problems, other animals that need our help, other bullies who think they can intimidate people into silence." Tommy nodded, understanding that his journey from invisible boy to community hero was really just the first chapter of a much larger story. "What do we do next?" Mrs. Blackwood smiled and placed a weathered hand on his shoulder. "We keep fighting, Tommy. We keep standing up for what's right, and we keep believing that courage and compassion can change the world, one act of kindness at a time." As the sun set over Millbrook Valley, painting the sky in brilliant colors that seemed to promise infinite possibilities, Tommy realized that he had found his purpose in life. He would continue to be a voice for the voiceless, a protector of the innocent, and a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. The boy who had once collected kindling in silence had become a young man who understood that true strength came not from intimidation or wealth, but from the willingness to stand up for what was right, no matter how impossible the odds might seem. Dear listeners, we hope Tommy and Scout's journey has touched your hearts as much as it has ours. Their story reminds us that courage comes in all sizes, and that sometimes the smallest among us can create the biggest changes. Like Mrs. Blackwood's hidden documents that waited decades to reveal the truth, we too have prepared something special for you On your left, you'll find a carefully curated playlist of equally moving stories about ordinary people who became extraordinary heroes through simple acts of kindness and courage. If Tommy's bravery inspired you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up to help us share these powerful messages with others who need to hear them. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore the complexities of human nature and the triumph of good over evil. Join our community in the comments below and tell us about a time when you showed courage in the face of adversity. Together we can build a world where kindness always wins. We'll be waiting to hear your stories.